So this is the final session. It's going to be in a different format. I think we all somewhat overwhelmed by the past couple of days, so this will be in a roundtable conversation format, notwithstanding the table itself being not round. So this newspaper front page, it's over, is I think what every conflicted society would have hoped. We are still craving this kind of front page news, but the Belfast Telegraph newspaper and the good people of Northern Ireland have been able to get it. We are now marking 25 years to the Good Friday or the Belfast Agreement, and it has been all over the world in April. Until now, there are conferences and news reports and events all around the 25 years to the Good Friday Agreement. But even before Northern Ireland has become a site of political pilgrimage, a site of study, a site of delegations from all over the world are coming to Northern Ireland to learn about the peace process. People from Northern Ireland are going around the world sharing insights. And if you Google the exact phrase, lessons from Northern Ireland, which I've done many times, I think there's like a 250,000 results with the exact phrase, lessons from Northern Ireland. If you add Northern Ireland's lessons and so on, there's even more, and there are lots of books and reports and think tank intervention with this idea of lessons from Northern Ireland. But there is also, as you know, a specific link or specific links between Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and Northern Ireland. Right now, the most visible manifestation, and Roshin was mentioning it in the morning, is this is Belfast, basically. West Belfast with the Palestinian flag and the Irish flag, and East Belfast with the Israeli flags, the Union Jack. It's slightly manipulative because this was just before there was a football match where the Israeli team was in Belfast. And not everyone in Belfast is obsessed with here, but there are links, there are many links. And historically and comparatively, they're much more complex than this idea of flags. And I'll share a story which some of you have heard, but when I was doing my PhD research, I interviewed some former IRA prisoners, and one of them was very, very senior in the organization. He told me that in 1993 he was in prison, in British prison, and this was the most, the period in Northern Ireland when the despair was the greatest. Not necessarily the violence, but the lack of hope was the most profound. And he was in prison, and in the cell next door, they had a smuggled radio transistor, and they would be able to hear the news and write it down on little pieces of papers and smuggle them through the cells. And he told me he was there with some of, the senior people of the IRA, and they got the message that Rabin and Arafat have shaken hands in the White House and doing peace. And he told me, you cannot imagine how it affected us. You cannot imagine what hope it has given us. And he was also saying, and we also thought, if these crazy fuckers could do it, we can do it too. And I told him, well done. By now the situation is a bit different, but we do have all of these links, and especially in the last decade or 15 years, and we'll hear about it more, there are lots of suggestion by think tank, by NGOs, by politicians, in academic articles that Northern Ireland, that the lessons from Northern Ireland paradigm is especially relevant, pertinent to our situation. So you can see lots of this idea of lessons from Northern Ireland to Israel, Palestine, from Belfast to Jerusalem, etc. There's lots of delegations going there. We'll hear about them in a second. There's all sorts of complex relations. Danny showed us earlier a photograph that he has taken, so I'm jealous. So this is a photograph, and it's really interesting, and I'm sure some of the other people would be able to articulate it in a more profound way. But basically, this is a photograph of the West Bank wall placed on the actual separation wall in West Belfast. which I photographed and I'm bringing back to Jerusalem. So there's something profound there. So I used it once for a presentation, and
put it back on the wall.
and my title was "Mirror, Mirror on the Wall." But so it's 25 years to the Good Friday Peace Agreement in a much more localized and less global anniversary. It's exactly 10 years since we've went with the first Hebrew University study visit to Northern Ireland, and it's very, very nice to have some of the students who have been on these delegations here. So we're going to do a roundtable discussion, very informal. I'm going to moderate. I'm going to ask some questions to start off, and then we'll open it to discussion. Members of the panel can sit here now. So let me briefly introduce. So Amnon Be'eri Soliziano is the co-director of the Abraham Initiatives, an NGO based in Lod, headquartered in Lod, working for equal citizenship and equal rights between Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel. Now, it has always been a well-regarded organization doing important creative work, but I think over past years, its work has become increasingly more and more challenging and more essential, and ever more so in the last few months. So thank you very much for finding the time to join us. And as Amnon, I'm sure, will describe, the Abraham Initiatives have been going to Northern Ireland and studying models on various issues from policing to education to the civil service, I think for almost 20 years, but you'll tell us more. Lior Lers is any second now going to start as a faculty at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in the International Relations Department, and he's been with us on the very first study visit to Northern Ireland. And his book, Unofficial Peace Diplomacy, Private Peace Entrepreneurs in Conflict Resolution Processes, was published last year by Manchester University Press. Congratulations. It has case studies from Northern Ireland and from the Israeli-Palestinian context. Kieran McAvoy is professor at Queen's University Belfast. I've introduced him in some length yesterday. And Roisin McGlone is a human rights activist in Belfast. So thank you all. So I want to start, we'll start, each of you will reply, and then we can, I'm going to ask a few questions to start us off, and then you can ask each other questions and respond to each other, disagree with each other if needed, and at some point we'll open it to discussion. So as an opening question, can you identify one lesson, one aspect of the peace process and transition in Northern Ireland, which is for you the most profound, the most relevant, the most exportable, the most interesting? One thing, we'll have an opportunity to discuss other issues later, but can you start with one thing that left the most impression on you? Amnon, if you want to start.
So I have at least five.
So
five one things.
Start with one and we'll
Okay,
take.
so I'll start maybe with the first lesson that we, as Abraham Initiative, that we learned and actually imported to Israel and managed to institutionalize, because it's also the hardest, I would say, the toughest area of our work, which is police-community relations in Israel, and the fact of severe under-policing within the Arab community. And we basically witnessed this thing, which was very strange for Israeli eyes, the fact that police commanders, local police commanders, are sitting with community members, elected and not elected, and having a dialogue with them, and looking at those community members as if the police, needs to explain, needs to be accountable for the community. In Israel, it was a totally foreign notion that the police needs to be accountable for the citizens. No, the policeman reports to the senior policeman, to the top of echelons, and not to the community. And when we saw those partnerships, police-community partnerships, DPPs, I think that they were called, in Northern Ireland, and then we brought senior Israeli police commanders to see it with their own eyes, and then we took it back to Israel, and now it became the norm in the Israeli police.
Okay, great. Thank you, Amnon. I'm sure people will be interested to go back to the policing issue, which by now is alongside the judicial reform is the top news in Israel. Thank you, Leo.
Yeah, so as you know, I think the first issue that brought me actually for the first time to deal with the case of Northern Ireland is the question of private citizen in conflict resolution, and it's relevant to our topics of non-state actors. And eventually I was writing my PhD about what I call private peace entrepreneurs. It's private citizens serving as local peacemakers in different conflicts. And as I started working on this topic, I was looking on different cases, Middle East, Cold War, different places around the world. And then I started to see more and more interesting cases in Northern Ireland. Eventually, the most fascinating case that actually I dedicated the most longest chapter in the book about Brandon Daddy in Northern Ireland, that I saw as a fascinating case as someone that can, we talk in the morning about the grassroots and the high-level diplomacy, that actually can connect between the two. The private citizen that eventually can lead and promote official diplomacy. And he actually played a critical role, I can talk about later, in different stages in the 70s, in the 80s, even the beginning of the 90s, as a secret back channel between the British government and the Republican, the IRA, and the Sinn Féin, and nobody knew about it. I interviewed the people in his family, and later on, only after the peace agreement, everybody revealed about it, and his archive was open. There is a movie about it. So I think that here the lessons, but there are also other like Alec Reed, the priest, and also Roy McGee, that actually private citizens that are very useful, especially in what we call the pre-negotiation phase, when you don't have official relation, official recognition with non-state actors, paramilitary organization, you need these kind of unofficial actors, unofficial channels to play a role, even though sometimes officials don't like that they are interfering, these private citizens who care about them, they actually have a lot of resources and power that can help in critical stages in peacemaking.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Kieran.
Yeah, I could pull out a few. I think I'll put this one out there. As you said, Ron, we just had the 25-year anniversary event. I think I said yesterday that there were lots of events on, but we had a big conference at Queen's, and as I said, we got the band back together. So we had Blair and the Clintons and all of the, Jerry Adams and Bertie Ahern and Senator Mitchell and all of the players, and I found it very moving, actually, very emotionally moving to be there. And I suppose one of the things that struck me during that was the risks of presentism when you're in the middle of either the conflict or indeed the early stages of transition. And by way of illustration, during the conflict we used to talk about the politics of the latest atrocity. Essentially, whatever bomb had happened, whatever killing had happened the day before, that dominated the news, it dominated everybody's thinking and so forth. And then when we moved to the transitional context, one of the things that struck me was I was trying to figure out in my own head, John Hume won the Nobel Prize, and rightly so, right? John Hume had been a voice for peacemaking in Northern Ireland for 30 years. He was an incredible man. But David Trimble also won. And at the time, I thought, that's a man who has won the lottery and didn't buy a ticket, basically. I thought Trimble, it was partially his personality-wise. He was all elbows. He was not a particularly. He taught me. He was not a particularly nice man. I didn't like him, and he had been elected as the far right candidate of the also Unionist Party at the time. Anyway, I remember being pissed off that he had won. He had only been recently converted to the notion of peace, having been a very right-wing politician. And so I remember thinking, John Hume has spent his life at peacemaking, and this guy just sort of decides at the very, and you get yourself a Nobel Peace Prize, And anyway, so I was kind of pissed off at the time, I remember, and it was only reflecting, David Trimble died recently, and so I was at that conference thinking, you weren't very generous, really, like back in the day, you were really, and it was presentism, I was kind of bound up in the present, and looking back on it now, I can see Trimble, in his own awkward, spiky, elbowy, humourless way, had significant courage in terms of leading unionism to the Good Friday Agreement. So anyway, my abstraction from that is the risks of presentism. When you're in the middle of either the conflict itself, it's very obvious, but also in the transition, you're very caught up in the moment, and sometimes you have to sort of step back and take the bird's eye view, and I personally failed at that moment.
And also be generous to law professors, because he was constitutional law, wasn't he?
No, he was land law and equity. I mean, he's a dreadful teacher as well.
I suppose mine actually, I'm known is related to policing as well. And when you're involved in something really, really significant, And prior, when the Patent Commission was going on, before all these structures were all whatever, I was involved in bringing wasn't an ACC, it was the Deputy Chief Constable. I'm sure you won't mind me saying this now, even though it was secret at the time, a district commander and a number of other police officers out to South Africa, and we met with Robert McBride, and we met with him and a South African police officer. And the South African police officer said to our officers, so to speak, we used to hunt the boss, right? So he was talking about when he was in the ANC. And when we came back and we were doing the Policing in Partnership project, which was very secret and it was very delicate, and it was also very dangerous, because at that time Sinn Féin didn't want anyone to know they were engaging in any form of policing, because the Patent Commission was going on in the background. They didn't want anybody to know. As far as they were concerned, these people had to be reformed and, you know, whatever. And I remember sitting thinking one evening when I had a police officer and a senior IRA commander in my living room, and I remember thinking to myself, I'm making history here. I'm part of history. And that for me was a profound, it didn't matter about the leadership or the whatever. This was grassroots people on the ground making a difference. And I remember for me that was profound. And the other aspect of that as well is, if my family had known that I was doing that work, they would have been appalled. So there was a Rubicon crossed for me as well on a personal level, that I was actually starting to like these guys, you know. So yeah, it's a profound time.
Thank you.
Can I ask you also about, again, before we dive into the more technical issues, on a more personal experience kind of level, and obviously we have the visitors to Northern Ireland and the hosts. If you can remember for the first time you visited or the first time you hosted people from abroad after 98, like what surprised you most? What left an impression on coming to this other conflicted or divided society from here? What do you find most surprising, most weird, or most reassuring? Kind of the experience of coming from here, landing in Belfast, but also being from Belfast and getting the Israeli Palestinians delegations. Like, what kind of, once you've done the polite and the technical stuff, like when you were in the evening at the hotel or back home, like what was kind of one thing? I mean, anyone can start. It doesn't have to be on that order. Kieran.
And it's not just because you're here and there others are here. Hosting Breaking the Silence, for me, they just blew me away. The courage of them, their wit, they're just so impressive, and they were really solid. And the courage that these people are showing in terms of leadership and civil society in Israel, the amount of opprobrium that is being heaped upon them by their own community, and I just, at that moment, it blew me away.
Cool, thanks.
I was struck basically by the wealth of relevant lessons, and as soon as we landed, I think it is my first time, I almost instantly realized, you know, how much we can actually learn, and how many issues and different ideas can become relevant in our reality. And my guess was that it will be very instrumental, very helpful for us. And the truth of the matter is that we have been traveling back and forth. I think that I went probably 15 times with, again, policemen, educators, our municipal leaders, and so on and so forth. So many relevant, it was very relevant for us.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in the visit we had 10 years ago with the Minerva, so we had a lot of, I think, very strong and emotional experience, and part of it was actually surprised that there are still peaceful, there's still segregation, but still the strongest experience for me was the meeting with ex-combat, with ex-prisoner, or the project of From Prison to Peace, and seeing ex-combats from the different organizations, loyalists together with Republican, going to schools and talking with students, high school students, about reconciliation and about their experience. And for us, Israelis and Palestinian, with all the, you know, cynical and everything, that really something that struck us. That's why eventually I wrote the article about prisoner release in Israel, Palestine, and in Northern Ireland, But thinking in our context, it means taking Hamas and Jihad Islamic prisoners, going together with the most radical Jewish terrorist organization like Tag Mahir or something like that, going to school one day and talking about this, because this is something that thinking about our political imagination can never go this way. So with all the other things that we saw, we said, oh, this is not exactly peace, it's more complicated. When we saw that, this is, I think, something that really struck me. That's why I started looking more and more, because the Palestinian prisoner is such a strong issue also in our conflict. And even in the mural, you can see the PLO and the IRA. That's why it's something that after that I continue to follow this issue about how we can learn from this model of prisoner release also in Israel and Palestine.
I suppose I don't remember the first visit I ever had, or I can't remember the first country I went to, or I can't remember the first group to come over, because after the Good Friday Agreement, there was an awful lot of energy about. And energy, I think Solinsky, the American trade unionist, said, you know, energy creates friction, and friction creates movement, and movement creates change. And we were all really in the midst of all of that. And I suppose for me, I was very envious of the concept of Ubuntu in South Africa. You know, the fact that people had compassion for one another in circumstances, and it was about treating the other like you wanted to be treated yourself. And I was always very jealous of that, which we didn't seem to have. And I'm not just saying this because of where I am, but I have to say the visits from the Minerva Centre, from the Hebrew University, for me, for some reason, the engagement of the young people, their energy to do something in a situation that seemed intractable, you know, and there were, every year they came, you know, different students came, and they still had the energy, and they still, how can we do this? What can we do? Tell us what you've done. And that for me, because very often, you know, you get people coming to visit you, and, you know, maybe all of the delegation are not that interested, or some of them are, or a few of them are, or whatever. Every single one of them. I mean, I remember I used to be bombarded with questions walking up and down the interfaces, and it was, you know, and they were fighting, and it was because of their passion for what they'd done. And that stood out for me, because I had never actually come across a community, or sorry, a country where so many young people, you have great hope here. If you have those young people and you can harness that energy, you know, I just felt there's hope, you know, when everybody else was telling me there wasn't. And so for me, and I'm not just saying it because I'm here, I really, really mean it.
Of course, we should recall that our students were the best, and not everyone.
Yeah. Basically wrong.
Okay, can we talk about policing and policing reform and Israel in Northern Ireland, police connection and so on? Because, you know, as I mean, we talked a little bit about the judicial reform with our international friends, but crime and under-policing in the Palestinian towns and neighborhoods within Israel has really become one of the main issues, the main challenges in Israel. And there are a lot of parallels in the problem, as it used to be in Northern Ireland, in the sense of communities, neighborhoods, small towns, where there's a policing vacuum, and there are debates about the causes, but there's no effective policing. Crime is rising, and it's a huge issue socially, politically, economically. And Northern Ireland, again, with all the critiques and all the limitation, we've seen huge transformation in policing, in the culture, in the treatment of police officers, in the way police officers behave, both in kind of ordinary policing, but also in riot control. I mean, I was amazed one time when I was in Belfast, and you can see the police officers kind of gently retreating from stone throwing, rather than seeing the role as killing as many people as possible. So let's try to talk about that from the different perspective. And Roshan has served on the policing board, and Kieran, you know, is a criminologist and involved in the restorative justice project. And from your perspective, so I think if we can untangle it more from the, you know, not the big technical issues of the patent commissions and the blueprints and so on, but in terms of the implementation. Because, I mean, we can all write, sorry, not all of us, but it's easier to write a blueprint for policing reform in Israel. I think the problem is more in the implementation. the kind of, so I'm interested more in the kind of middle management level, both in the police, in the communities, you know, on the kind of neighborhood level, town level, not the big political picture. So once you had the blueprint, once you brought Clifford Cheering and some clever people and write, how did it actually get implemented? Why it wasn't stuck and obstructed along the way as we would have assumed it would? So what?
Hey, I'll kick off. You want, Roisin?
Yeah. Work away.
So first thing I would say is that one of the clever things that the Patent Report did was its primacy on the emphasis upon human rights. And what happened was that exactly the kind of people you're talking about, so in the policing settlement in Northern Ireland, there was no process of lustration. There was no process by which people who had been involved in human rights abuses during the conflict, and there were many, at the hands of the police, were lustrated out. You know, they weren't. But what they did instead was they said, they gave them a big pension, exactly. And they said, look, there's going to be a new police force here, new police service actually. Its emphasis is going to be on human rights and on community policing. And that's going to be at the core of this. You have been involved in the policing of terrorism for the last 20, 25 years. If you don't think you're going to like this new regime, here's a very, very generous pension. That's what they did. And a lot of cops took, you know, who just thought, I don't want to be barred with this new thing. And so they made human rights and community policing at the very core of it. Now, I've been involved in the human rights movement for 30 years. I've been chair of CAJ, I don't know, 10 or 15. CAJ is like Bitsalem. I mean, so now what sensible, smart cops realized was that actually a properly implemented human rights framework is an effective management tool for policing. So everything that the cops do, and it's not perfect at all, but everything that cops do now in terms of policing is run through the human rights framework. And politically what that means is that there would not be a scintilla of difference if I was on a panel beside a senior PSNI officer, a senior police officer on the centrality of human rights. And what that means is that it stopped the right, and in particular the right within unionism, from corrupting policing in the way it had been done historically, where in effect during for the first 50 years of the conflict, the police were the armed wing of unionism essentially, right? And so by cops themselves actually internalizing and realizing rights are a very effective way of, you know, balancing rights. What Ron's example is a perfect one. Public order policing, you know, balancing the rights of perhaps the residents versus those who are rioting, thinking about those things through. We had a human rights advisor operationally working with the police to work through complex human rights dynamics, and it's just standard practice now. That's how cops think about policing. So the mainstreaming of that, Ron, and cops actually realizing human rights are our friend in terms of making complicated managerial decisions. They're not something imposed upon us by these bloody lefty do-gooders. That's what good policing looks like, and that's just a given now in the police. It's a total transformation in the policing culture, that bit. So for me, that bit, and in terms of the community bit, the second bit of that dynamic, as Ron said, I think I mentioned it briefly yesterday. So I was involved in a process of me and three others of persuading the IRA to go out of business in terms of kneecapping. So basically, the IRA used to be involved in their own informal policing. So it's a long-winded story. I'll tell it in 20 seconds. And eventually, over a period of a couple of years, we persuaded the IRA that there was an alternative way to do this by establishing community-based restorative justice schemes, non-violent, human rights protecting, staffed by ex-combatants, ex-IRA combatants, but involved in restorative work, right? Mediation, dispute resolution, lawful human rights compliant, and so forth. But what then happens is those projects become one of the central important bridges in terms of developing relationships between historically estranged Republican communities who have no experience of real community policing ever, and the cops themselves. So what that looks like now is you have on the board, you would have had the former Assistant Chief Constable of the RUC on the Community Restorative Justice Board, along with two former senior IRA people who, you know, and they used to do talks together and say, these guys used to try to kill me, and I used to try to lock them up, or I wouldn't have been that unhappy if they were killed either. And so what happens now is, at a community level, the police will sit down at a local community level with former IRA combatants, and they divide up cases. Literally, they'll say, okay, they'll look at caseloads, and they say, and sometimes there's a pushback from the community saying, you know, for example, traveller violence or something, you know, sometimes the cops will be going, Like we've significant problems in the policing of traveller communities, you know, a very historically difficult relationship, Irish traveller communities, and the cops. And so sometimes the cops are going, there's a really complex intergenerational dispute with the travellers. You fancy doing that case? And the community project going, fuck off, you do it yourselves. But it's that kind of a dialogue that would have been unthinkable. That's police officers sitting down with former IRA combatants and literally dividing up who's going to do what. It's all lawful, it's all human rights compliant, but it's using restorative justice. So if you, at a macro level and at a middle management level, you have rights discourse at the centre of all police planning, and then at that kind of very grassroots level, you literally have former IRA combatants and police officers dividing up cases and how communities are going to be policed. So for me, those are the two standout bits in terms of the transformation of policing.
Amnon, you want to?
No. I think that I want to take us to the big picture. I think that in Northern Ireland, the Patton report and the total change of the police, the move from the former police force to the PSNI, it is a new police, new name, new symbols, new practices, new everything, even arms, even vehicles, even everything, supervision, scrutinize everything. It's part of a political agreement, and it's a sub-agreement of a big peace agreement. And in Israel, we are, I think that the right way is to compare the Israeli police force, current police force, to the previous police force in Northern Ireland. This is our reality in Israel, and since there is no reform in Israel, and there is no reform in the horizon as well, our best shots are to introduce a number of critically important mechanisms and to convince the Israeli police to adopt them. Everything may change or will change or hopefully will change if there will be a political arrangement inside of Israel between the Jewish majority and the Palestinian minority. Currently, we are in the middle of this conflict. So I think that this is the main problem. It's not so much the middle management or practices on the ground. It's the big picture, and we're missing a political agreement or a reform of the Israeli police.
Okay, so I think this is.
Just one more thing. The Israeli police still views, essentially, basically, the Palestinian minority in Israel as part of the enemy. And this is an inherent contradiction. You cannot really provide services, serve and protect the same population that is seen as the enemy. And I think that in Israel, this is pretty much still the case.
And I think this is it's a sobering observation, because if I understand you, Amnon, so one of the lessons we can articulate is actually that there are no half measures. So the policing reform in Northern Ireland was because it was like a literal restart. You shut down and you restart, as the IT people sometimes tell us to do, and you rebrand the whole thing down to the uniform. And in this context, you can build it. So I think if this is right, then it's a kind of sobering reflection that localized kind of half measures reform won't be as effective. Or won't be effective at all.
Steps, are always very much reversible, and we see it now.
I would agree to that too. I absolutely agree with that. But I think you've got to take into consideration two elements. And one is the majority of the rank and file officers that were in the RUC stayed in the PSNI. It was mainly the senior ranks who benefited most from the financial benefits that they were given. There were some long-serving sergeants and inspectors. And one of the things that you can't legislate for, you can make all the transformation in badges and IT equipment and image and whatever, but you can't legislate for attitude. And that was one of the things that we worked on, because one of the central tenets of the Patton report, or the new Commission into Policing, was a concept of policing with the community. And that's completely counterintuitive to police officers. And what we had to do was we had to convince police officers that actually, slightly different from Kieran in terms of that human rights would be their best friend, but actually engaging at a community level with a very active, engaged political community makes their job easier. And if there's one thing a police officer will respond to, it's if you make their job easier. So if they can, and this is a very dirty word in the north of Ireland, but if they can get the intelligence from the local community that will make their job easier, that goes a long way to changing attitudes. And also what we did was we connected people in with local networks. So police officers had never got local networks. They didn't have local networks because they were swamp clearance. In many occasions, they put on their ninja suits and they went in and they battened people off the road.
Yeah.
They didn't have local networks, whereas we had very sophisticated local networks of activists who knew everybody in the street, who knew all the police officers on some occasions didn't even know the names of the schools that the kids went to. I'll just tell you a very, very funny story. My son went through his Irish language. All his education was through the Irish language. And when the police were changing their uniform and they were changing their tactics, their school's right in the middle of the heart of West Belfast, and they were in a secondary school. So there were young lads around about 15, 16, 17. And what they used to do, the lads decided themselves in this Irish school, which is the epitome of what the police would see as their enemy, that every time they saw a Land Rover, they would wave at them, right? So they started to do this campaign that everywhere they went, they could see these kids in these green and gold uniform, or school uniforms, waving at them. You could see these cops just be completely freaked out. What the fuck? They're planning an attack, and they were looking behind them or whatever. And it was funny, the kids did that of their own volition, but I'm just saying to you that, it was quite funny, the Beachmount Leisure Centre, and you could see the cops stopping, and then will we get out, will we not?
Suspicious waving.
Suspicious waving. So, there were the funny stories, but it is about changing the attitudes as well. It's not just about, you can change all the other things, but, it's about changing that as well.
Amnon, can you talk about the response in Israel from the police officers? You've traveled there, and so the response in Israel to the Northern Ireland ideas about policing, because you've mentioned you've taken I think pretty senior police officers to Northern Ireland, so obviously it didn't solve all the problem with crime in Palestinian areas in Israel, but can you talk about the response? Can you talk about how they felt about the very idea of them landing from another society, and that society being Northern Ireland, about that experience? For you, was it a source of kind of cultural capital to say, look, this is what they've done there, so the ideas are more legitimate? Or was there also a backlash, a kind of resentment? Because I think there's some
huge backlash.
Okay.
The minority, even a small minority within those, high-ranked police officers, could relate and understood and actually got, learned something and actually brought it back and implemented some of the things. The chief commissioner of the Israeli police at the time was very supportive, but all in all, there was almost there was a lot of resistance, a lot of now, those officers didn't like it that we're bringing them to Northern Ireland, that it is imposed on them to go to Northern Ireland, and we're rubbing, their fault or their the issues in their face by actually showing them, look at what's happening here, look back at what is happening in at home, and it's totally different. And it was like putting a mirror in their face. And eventually, those policemen could not contain it, could not take it anymore, and the police stopped it. They could not. The commissioner of the Israeli police just stopped those delegations because he could not. There was like an intifada within the police. There was like an uprising within the police against this initiative.
Just to add that I think the situation is even worse when we are looking in East Jerusalem. I was working a lot in the Jerusalem Institute on these issues, and of course the Palestinians see the police as the army, as the border, as everything, as part of the occupation, and this is a tool in the occupation. You can see that sometimes when you have tension, they will put more tickets as a way to punish the resident. And at the same
parking tickets or traffic violations.
And it's clearly, it's publicly, not just Ben-Gvir, by the way, it's been done all over the years. And at the same time, you will see that they will get into the neighborhood only if there is a security issue, terror, and usually people will not call the police. And over the years, we had some meetings with the police, also tried to meet between Palestinian And I felt what you said, that eventually, without structural changes, without an agreement, without something that completely changes the situation, it's almost impossible in Jerusalem. It's so sensitive when looking on the holy sites, because what the police will do in place like Al-Aqsa, Temple Mount, it's not just immoral or problematic, it can explode the Middle East. And we always said maybe we need to find a special police just for the holy site. Maybe it's just a special police, community police for each Jerusalem, but it's really something impossible without a real political change.
Roshan, can we talk a little bit about the de-escalation work that the project you've been involved in? Because I think for us it's one of the most fascinating aspects, and I think to some degree, I mean, obviously it's linked with the big picture political development, but I think what I found, and I think others have found so fascinating, that it's really kind of micro level interface neighborhood in, you know, particular parts of Belfast. It's very kind of micro levels. It's people who would know the names of everyone around and on the street level. And so we had it was mentioned in a previous panel, the flare-up of violence in 2 years ago in May 21, and it's one of these things normally we have the official name for wars and events, but I think we still refer to it as May 21 events. It's become the kind of the colloquial term. And what was so frightening for many of us was the way it was localized violence in the areas. It's a bit like your interface. We call it the mixed areas, mixed neighborhoods, mixed towns, where people, you know, Jews and Muslims or Jews and Palestinians live not in harmony, but have been living without any kind of direct, and it started this kind of street level violence, but it's not combatants, it's not anything like that. And in some areas it continued for a week, in some areas it will be overnight. And I remember, you know, you wake up, I mean, I was in Jerusalem, which by the way wasn't the worst place at that time, and you wake up in the morning and you see what happened at night and you think, oh God, let it rain, let just people not go out of the street. And the project you were describing, when you just have some, well, not just, but basically this kind of sensible adults on both sides who prepare in advance and then try to do this de-escalation. On one level, it's not very ambitious. It's not peace. It's just when violence starts, can we contain it? But on the other hand, it's extremely ambitious, and for me, this is, if you can bring a bit of it, of these techniques from Northern Ireland here, that will be fantastic. So can you talk a little bit about how to, you know, how the mechanisms work? I know you mentioned it a little bit, but really about how you sustain it through the first wave of violence. Because I think many of us have been involved in, you know, dialogue groups and joint football, joint cooking, all sorts of things. And from my experience, at least, once you have, and bilingual schools and the whole shebang, but once you have violence starts, you have another war, another thing, then, you know, it's very, communication breaks. And it's very hard to contain it. I think what you're describing is something that can kind of go through the violence and keep communication open and trust. So I think, so I'll be interested in the mechanisms, and then I'm sure people will have follow-up questions.
Well, I'll tell you where the concept came from. And I know it had happened in a different way in South Africa, but that wasn't where it came from for us. You have the concept and then you have the process. Okay, so the concept came from, people forget this, but prior to the Good Friday Agreement, there was the Drumcree dispute in 94 to 96, and we had some of the worst violence that had ever been perpetrated from when an Orange Parade went down through Portadown. And I was working in North Belfast at the time, and North Belfast was a patchwork quilt of all these different communities, Protestant Catholic. And there was enormous violence. I mean, it doesn't seem a lot to you, but if you multiply this by your population, we had 110 nationalist families displaced from their homes overnight, and 20 Protestant families, some of who included people who were gay. And we were working in this environment where literally, you know, places were burning around us. And we were trying to get community activists out on the ground to do something about it. I was working in a community development centre in North Belfast. And afterwards, we decided to do a community inquiry. And what we did was we just got a bit of money and we went around all the different areas and we asked people to come forward and give testimony and tell us what had happened. And this fascinating picture emerged. And what it emerged was that very often the violence was not about one community attacking the other, but it was about rumours. It was about young people starting something and then older brothers getting involved, family members getting involved. And we sat after we analysed this community inquiry and thought, my God, you know, it's been portrayed in the media across the world that, you know, people were attacking each other. And very often people left. Some people were intimidated out of their homes, but very often people left their homes because they were absolutely terrified. So we did this analysis anyway, and I got the community representatives together in North Belfast, which is already, you know, a very difficult place. We had to meet the community activists separately. And I said to them, you know, what can we do about this? And one of the guys said to me, you know, two things. First of all, he said, I would love to have done something about it, but I was, you know, but I didn't know anybody on the other side. And on the other hand then, and I'll try and be brief because I know we're short for time, but on the other hand, I was saying to people, would you be prepared to give your phone number over to someone on the other side? And they were going, no. And there was a distrust because they didn't know whether they'd be set up or, you know, somebody would get their number and be able to trace something. And mobile phone technology was coming in at the time. And I remember people saying, look, it wouldn't do much good if I gave you my home number because I wouldn't be at home. I would be out on the streets trying to do things. So that was the concept. And the concept was, well, how do we find a way for people who are willing to communicate with each other? And we had to get very prominent people, and by I mean prominent people, I mean members of the armed group, you know, the previously armed groups, not the police, the previously armed groups. So we asked each community then in the different areas, because there's not one area, to identify phone holders in each of those areas who would be prepared to speak to the other side if something did happen. And it was very problematic at the beginning, and that's when I'm talking about the mechanisms, Ron. I couldn't describe it now. It was a long process. But what I decided was, and I think this was the difference, I decided that I was going to bring these people together, these phone holders together, and people said to me, you are absolutely mad. You are crazy. And the first meeting, we had to have it in the City Hall because we couldn't agree on a neutral venue. And we had it in the City Hall, and people spoke through microphones, you know, like this. And afterwards, I had a queue of people outside my office coming in and telling me all the reasons why they shouldn't meet again. Like, people were saying things like, I think that guy over there was taping me. I think he had a tape recorder in his bag. And I'm thinking to myself, well, what exactly were you saying that, you know, would be so important to tape? You know, so, you know, we went through years of that. And then we did a systematic thing where we logged. So what we said was, we'll come together every Friday and we'll spend the first hour logging all the incidents that have happened over the previous week, okay? And it started off, we were attacked by the other community, and I had a researcher and I said to her, every time anybody says that, stop them and say, what time was this at? How many people were involved? What age were they? Okay? So we developed this log where it was, well, 3 5-year-olds were throwing stones at 5 o'clock in the evening. And slowly but surely, people started to catch on. And instead of it being an hour and a half of people report, no, they attacked us, it started to be. And then I'm a great believer in breaking bread together. So I started to provide a meal for people when they came to those meetings. And then we were able to have it out in the community. So it was a long process, but I have written about it, but I can't remember where it is. You know, unlike I was just going to say, I think you've all written books except me, but that's because I'm a woman and I'm too busy. Sorry. I know, totally sexist. But you know, it's a long process, but it's really about, it's not just about the technology, or it's not about what lists you have. It's about engaging people with each other sometimes for very different reasons. So the nationalist community wanted to present themselves as greater than now. They wanted to say, we're very magnanimous. We don't want to attack the other community. The Protestant community had this terrible problem where Protestant people were moving out of these interface areas, and they wanted a sustained population in those areas. So if they could bring peace to those areas, people would more likely stay. So people have different needs. So it was about identifying what the different community needs were and playing to those needs. And so I don't know if that helps.
Do you want to respond or ask a follow-up question?
I'll just say that we heard about it last year in our last visit to Northern Ireland with elected leaders from the mixed cities, and actually we are trying to put together this idea in Israel now in the mixed cities, based on WhatsApp groups. So the WhatsApp technology, which in Israel is very popular, can be a technical tool, and yeah, so we are trying to implement this idea also in Israel.
Brilliant.
Yoav, you want to respond or ask a follow-up question?
No, just to say that I think the question of shared spaces is this issue that if we're talking about Jerusalem, Belfast, it's always in many, many articles about divided cities. You start with Jerusalem, Belfast. We talked about prisoners, we have other parades. So also divided city, you usually start, sometimes Nicosia is getting in, but usually Jerusalem, Belfast. And I think what we saw, especially when we have the security fence wall between East Jerusalem and the West Bank, actually created a separation of the Palestinians from the area that used to be in Bethlehem, and they are moving more to West Jerusalem. And then it created, on the one hand, much more tension, much more friction, and much more racism and incident. But on the other hand, you can see also some patterns of shared spaces. And we can see that in the university, this also will happen in Belfast, and we can see that sometimes in the center, in an area like Mamila, there are very interesting articles on this area. But it's McGinty wrote this interesting book about the everyday piece. And this is an ongoing discussion, relevant to discussion normalization that we before. If you can consider that people are somehow in this shared space, in this specific moment, somehow they are living together, they are forgetting everything, if it's in the university, if it's in Mamila, if it's somewhere, if this actually an everyday piece, or if this is normalizing the situation, or if it's something specifically that we can read out of it more than it. Or maybe with this, there is something here that can spill over to others. And this is also an ongoing discussion, especially when you have an ongoing conflict. It's different to think after a post-conflict.
Right. Can I make a comment about the term shared spaces? I would be reluctant to describe places or spaces or institutions where in Israel, where Jews and Palestinians are in contact as shared spaces, because the shared space is, at least for us, means something deeper than a physical contact or close physical proximity between Jews and Arabs. It has to offer more a sense of belonging and responsibility and equality. So yeah, just.
And also the question of employment, for example, of Jews and Palestinians. What are the conditions? If it's equal employment, or if they are meeting in an equal way, or if they are meeting, as a workers and a boss or something like that. Yeah. The basic conditions of the meeting.
And we can maybe connect it to the previous panel. So one of the questions that arose, we had a question on transitional justice at the level of the city, at the municipal level. And one of the questions that arose, specifically on Tel Aviv, but it's a broader question. So on the one hand, there's the drive to kind of give more powers or more hope to the municipality, hoping that the municipality will be or could be more liberal, progressive, advanced than the national level, or you don't need to wait for the national level to move, you can do it on the municipal level. But on the other hand, the concern that the municipality can actually be more reactionary, less liberal, it will be a more dangerous move to do policy at the municipal level. So I don't know, Kieran Roshan, if you have any insights from Northern Ireland on this particular issue, or maybe, I don't know, I mean, maybe Kieran, for you, the municipal level has just not been a factor, and that's also a lesson we can...
I wouldn't say, are you talking at the council level?
Yeah, Belfast City Council, not really.
No.
I mean, they fund some of the restorative justice work, so they're a useful source for funding, and you would get hearing for pragmatic community-based conflict resolution at the council level, but they're less a significant player than at the departmental level or at the police level in Belfast.
And I think the community organisations within the council probably would get funding from them, so that makes it possible for them to engage in some of these activities. But there's certainly no leadership at that level in terms of, no.
So in Israel, I think that the municipal level is becoming more and more important in terms of the relations between Israeli Palestinians and Jews, and in fact, on the municipal level, we can see in the mixed cities, at least right after the last municipal elections, almost 5 years ago, that in all of the mixed cities, political partnerships were formed between Jewish and Arab parties on the municipal level. And in a way, some will argue that those political partnerships, mainly between mayors from Likud, from right-wing Likud, and deputy mayors from the Islamic movement in some places like in Akko, almost legitimized or paved the way for what Netanyahu was aspiring to do, to have a coalition or a partnership with the Islamic movement, with Mansour Abbas, and legitimized it. And still in some mixed cities, in Akko, in Ramle, in Haifa and Lod, it broke a little bit, but in Nofa Galil, Upper Nazareth, a political partnership or Jewish and Arab parties that run the city together is a very significant development.
We maybe take some questions from the audience for the panel. Limor. Okay.
Or suggest, I don't know.
Make it a response triggering remark.
Okay, I'll try. So it's like I have my thoughts about the questions that were posed. And so first I think that there is an importance into the question of what is the vision of peace that we are aiming for. It's like a fundamental thing because the traditional way of thinking about Israel-Palestine is separation, which is totally the opposite of what happened. So I think the first step is to reorient how we think about peace here. And I think this is what we need to do and endorse the understanding of peace as partnership, equality and stuff. So this is like a first step. And then following on Karen presentism, I thought about the risk of dramatism and like what is catching our hearts and attention. And those are great leaders that sign great papers. But actually, I think what is more, for me at least, what I'm looking for are those processes that are long. So like the one that you were describing, long and deep, and actually changing the foundations of realities in that then on top of those changes great leaders and papers can be written and will have meaningful outcomes, because in Northern Ireland you had a paper that was signed in the early 70s and really didn't matter a lot, right? Only triggered like John Hume was convinced that this is the right forward, right? And so that's my second one. And so I'm looking into the blind spot, I think, of transitional justice in general, which is looking at the socioeconomic dimensions, bread and butter issues of public goods that are delivered to fairly, anti-discrimination practices that were, and then to look so for me, I think the lessons that I'm looking for are what's happened during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, early 90s, in Northern Ireland that paved the way for a sustainable agreement, something like that. And just for the municipal level, I think that power sharing on the municipal level was practiced during the early maybe the 80s, I think. So maybe that's something. Well, Colin Cox wrote about it. You think it's not okay? So I triggered a response.
Dave.
The question that bothers me, and that bothered me also in my short experience in Northern Ireland, is assuming that you've really got general consensus between the main groups, you have the rejectionists. And the question is, how are you going to deal with the rejectionists and stop them having a wrecking power? That is what bothers me more than anything else.
Yeah.
Thanks. Actually, the end of the panel sort of, I was holding on a question, then you ended with shared municipalities. And I was thinking about the element of Arab or Palestinian Israelis who are part of the police force. So, how does that enter the picture that you described of the police force? I mean, we know that, of course, there's an under policing, and I mean, that was a even nice statement to what's happening, you know, the neglect and the violent, you know, compared with the violent reality in Arab communities in Israel. But I'm thinking, you know, you were saying the police sees the Arab or Palestinian community as the enemy. We had that in the October events also of 2000 and the OR committee. We know there's something. I mean, you know, Arab or Palestinian Israelis demonstrating is not the same as Jewish Israelis demonstrating, for sure. But I think I still take it as too much of a black and white dichotomic picture, and I think there's more to it. And if you, I don't know the numbers of police officers who are Arab or Palestinian Israelis, and also maybe that could be a way forward if we're talking about community policing within Arab areas. That's one thing. And then more for the visitors to Northern Ireland, thank you for saying that we have hope and energy and everything, but obviously we're missing something. You said there were a lot of lessons learned. I'm asking to everyone, but what are or were we missing? If you can, you know, help us.
Sure.
Thanks.
Maybe let him reply and then do
Should
another
we
round.
start maybe with the last question?
Sure.
So first of all, in terms of numbers, within the Israeli police, blue police, regular police, we are talking about 2% Arabs. Most of them are Christian and Druze. In the border police, the numbers are very, very high, which tells you something about the problem. Many people will say if there were more Arabs, Muslim Arabs within the Israeli police, the police will change. But we think that the recruitment policy, you know, maybe it's important, but to some degree and not more, because it is about the culture of the Israeli police and not about numbers. And the border police is full of non-Jews, Arabs, Jews, and some Christians, and not so many Muslims. Yet it is a very brutal force when it comes to Israeli Arab citizens. So it tells you something. And look, you know, look in the U.S. or even in Britain and other places where the minorities are represented in the police, and they're not managing to change the attitude of the police toward the minority which they belong to. So the need is to change the culture of the police, and it's not only about recruitment. In terms of what we're missing, I think that basically we're missing a political arrangement between the majority and the minority. Israel is de facto a binational state, you know, whether we like it or not. And it's not defined this way, but de facto what Israel is, and if eventually Israel will be, you know, if eventually the arrangement or the peace, hopefully, between Israel and its neighbors will be based on a two-state solution, then small Israel will be a binational state with a small Palestinian minority. And if eventually it will be based on a one state, Israel will be binational with pretty much, you know, same proportion or a slightly advantage in terms of numbers to the Palestinians. But the mechanisms that should enable Jews and Palestinians to live together in the same territory should be developed and nurtured, and we should invest a lot in thinking about how to do it, because eventually this is the only way.
Yeah.
Interesting comments, Lamora, as always. And so a couple of things. Number one, I don't think that the macro signing a piece of paper and the micro, you need both, basically, and they're not mutually exclusive. But I would say that the piece of paper thing is actually really important. And certainly I felt, as I said, energized at that conference, but also there are naysayers. I mean, the Democratic Unionist Party, which is now the biggest party in Northern Ireland, they never signed the Good Friday Agreement. And there are elements of them that continue to try to undermine it. And one of the things that I thought at that conference was, we will defend this fucking agreement against the likes of you who want to bring it all down. And you need what actually, I'm just conscious, I'm looking at this audience, I've interviewed 3 people for our last book, and you were all supposed to be anonymous, so I can't say who you were, but one of you in our book on cause lawyers talked about the vision thing and the importance of the vision thing. And so the vision thing for me is the Good Friday Agreement. So it's actually really symbolically important in terms of, so you, of course, all the process that I talked about, the restorative justice process there, I summed it up in 20 seconds. It took about 8 years, in terms of hard graft, lots of bumps along the road and ups and downs, exactly. So you need both, essentially. You need the vision thing, you need the piece of paper, and you need the quality work that's happening underneath. In terms of David's question on the rejectionists, yeah, I mean, I don't want to exaggerate their significance, if I'm totally honest, David. I think that on the Republican side, dissident Republicans have zero buy-in in terms of the community. Like any armed group, they're capable of killing people. They tried, weirdly, in alliance with loyalist drug dealers recently to murder a senior police officer. But they are micro groups with no community support. And so I wouldn't give them too much significance. On the loyalist side, it's a complicated picture because in effect what has happened is there are still decent loyalist community activists who are members of that armed group, those armed groups. And Roisin and I would have worked over the years closely with some of them. And I think what we've always tried to do is to build pathways to go out of business for the progressive bits of loyalism. But at some stage, Sergio asked us earlier on this morning, like you're 25 years, why do you still have armed groups? And it's a really good question.
And we ask
It's
ourselves
a
all the
really
time.
good question. But so you build progressive pathways to transform and so on. But at some stage, it becomes a policing problem, to be frank. At some stage, if people are just using the name of a loyalist armed group that has a history and would be respected at least within some working class areas, at some stage, if that has just morphed into a criminal gang and you have done all the progressive work in terms of pathways to change, it's a policing problem. But I wouldn't, on either side, I would not overemphasize their political importance because they are micro groups without significant community support. The peace process is solid. And so there are issues to be managed, and we do it as progressively as we can, but at some stage it morphs into a policing problem.
So they're not ideologically motivated?
No.
No, I mean,
They say they are.
on the Republican
But
side,
it's
there
not
are
authentic.
some
Right.
who are ideologically motivated. There are others who have morphed into a criminal gang as well. I think there's a significant push, I think, within dissident Republicanism to go out of business for a number of those groups. And the same has been happening, but it's been happening for years on the loyalist side. I mean, people like Jonathan Powell, like Tony Blair's former chief of staff, lent his weight to a very significant, it looked at the time, initiative to let the main loyalist armed groups to go out of business. It's 5 years ago?
More,
And
maybe.
and it's just like you think all of that political clout, like to get someone as important as him, putting his name to it, and I'm sure he looks back on that and he's kind of embarrassed because they're still there,
And last week, there's a feud going on at the moment between a number of criminal gangs, and they're shooting each other and whatever. And
These are members of different wings of the UDA, so they're still around.
Yeah.
But
But can I ask,
Sure.
just follow up, because sometimes my sense, and again, from the outsider, and I don't know so much about Northern Ireland, but despite the fact that I visited, sometimes when you sit with people, mainly loyalists, and you scratch the surface after a pint or two, they would you will discover this sentiment, and some will say, historically, we are on the losing side. On the losing side. We're losing. We have lost this. The big picture is that we are losing and they are winning, and basically, and so this is why I asked about those armed groups. If this is a manifestation of the same sentiment of we've lost, and let's make sure that if worse comes to worse, we're armed or whatever. I don't know.
And I think just to say, you can respond to it also in connected to the broader issue, which is one of the lessons for Northern Ireland as well. How do you manage the losers? How do you not call them losers? How do you manage it both on the micro level, on the macro level? Because I think, and this is also one of the lessons from Oslo and from South Africa, because part of the thing is to keep, you have an oppressive side in power, and there are very few precedent in history of a community or a state suddenly saying, oh, we were the bad guys, please have all our resources and weapons and we'll go ahead. It doesn't work like that. So you need to, for people to take responsibility, but also to kind of manage dignity while, and not refer to them as the losing side, because it's more than that. So I think, so and this is as a follow-up for Amnon's question, just putting it in a broader scale.
You know, so some of the uprising that we had within the Israeli police is that at some degree they said, basically you're bringing us here to show us what is our future. We are going to lose this.
Yeah.
And then we stopped.
Yeah, and I get that. And, you got to remember as well that the Loyalists, through their whole campaign, said that they were reactive to IRA violence. So they were, I'm not saying I believe that, I'm telling you what they said they were. So they say that they were reactive to IRA violence, and IRA violence, for all intents and purposes, is finished. They haven't lost, they've won, right? So if you want to interpret it in a different way, so for me, it does come down. I mean, I completely agree with Kieran. I mean, all this initiative, and one of the things that there's a guy called Plum Smith who was a loyalist. He was Red Hand Commandos. And Plum worked with me for a very long time, God rest his soul, he's dead now. And he used to say to me all the time, Roisin, we are so good at painting ourselves into corners and having no way out. And it is a pattern of loyalist groupings to do things that they couldn't find their way out of. They just couldn't find their way out of because they hadn't thought through what the next stage would be. And it's a bit like you were saying about the police. Think this through. It may not be this year or 10 years' time or the next generation. But I just want to make a comment on the point you were making about what was happening in the 70s and 80s and the 90s. And I suppose I come from a nationalist background, Republican background, and we weren't given the services that we would have been able to get. So by very definition, that community were activists, and they provided everything from summer schemes for children to youth clubs. And I remember as a student taking part in benefits take-up campaigns, where we were going out in the streets and knocking door to door and saying to people, are you getting your full benefit? Because no one was ever going to give them their full benefit. So there was a history within that community of activism, and it goes into the question that you've just said. There wasn't a history within the loyalist community of activism because most of their councillors, most of their elected representatives, while they didn't represent them well, were there, whereas Sinn Féin didn't have SDLP were about. But there was a whole generations of activists that just got more and more sophisticated. And if you think about, I think the best example of it, there was community development, and community development is a very powerful tool. And there was a real movement of community development, particularly in the 70s and the 80s, as a discipline. It wasn't just about doing it, it was a discipline. People promoted it, advice centres, that sort of thing. But I remember the Yes campaign, for the Good Friday Agreement, I think was a really good example of community activism where, across the community, they were geared up and they were ready to help people vote yes, to the referendum. So I think community activism is what we had in our favour.
Can I slightly contradict myself, which I do all the time?
That's the gentlemanly thing to do.
Because back to David's question, the one issue, and it links to what you were saying, Ron, there about people not being managing inverted commas losers and people who feel themselves as that they're losing in part of a political settlement. I think you've picked up in the last couple of days the mood music in terms of where things are at politically in Northern Ireland now is a re-energising of conversations around the United Ireland. And so you've got three blocks. You have nationalists and Republicans, now dominated by Republicans. As I said, Sinn Féin gets 3 out of 4 Catholic votes. You've got unionists on the other side. The majority of Sinn Féin was the biggest party in the last local elections. They're the biggest party now in the Assembly. And you have a middle block. And some of these people could go either way. Some of them are soft unionists, but they're open for a conversation about what a United Ireland might look like. This is where this conversation goes then in terms of putting some detail around that. So what does that look like? How is my British identity going to be protected? What does it look like in terms of health? What does it look like in terms of education, universities, jobs, and so forth? This is where the conversation goes, and that's where you build in protections about people not feeling that they're being overrun, that they're going to lose out. If this is the mood music, there's a majority now of Catholic young people as well, and so it's the way things are heading. It's heading in a particular direction. It's not going to happen today or tomorrow. But it's so important that that becomes an informed conversation. I think, as Roisin said earlier on, into the opposite of what happened in Brexit. So the people are really aware of what they're happening. And this takes us back to this issue. This is me contradicting myself now. Takes us back to this issue about the role of non-state armed groups in all of this. Because in the middle of all of that, and I'm thinking about people who I would regard as personal friends who are loyalist former combatants still within leadership positions within those armed groups. This is where you need sensible former armed group leaders. Because what you will have in that context are what we call ceasefire soldiers, younger people who never actually were involved in any fighting, right? Who say, what we'll do then is we'll just kill some Catholics, right? Because there's this conversation. The reality is loyalists haven't killed any Catholics in 25 years. They've killed lots of other loyalists, but that's something else. Like, the reason that has happened is because of a degree of discipline amongst the leadership of the loyalist armed groups. They haven't killed Catholics. And I know that conversations that happen, so you need those people. I do think those organizations need to go away, but you still need leadership within loyalist communities, in particular, if that is the direction of travel, that are saying, I lived through the conflict. I know what happens if we start killing Catholics. We are not going to do that. And so that, I think, doves us back to this idea of what is the role of non-state armed groups in transitional processes, but also, exactly as you say, people not feeling that they're losing out. And you're going to need organic, credible loyalist leadership in that conversation.
Leo, do you want to maybe relate to that?
Yeah, so first I think just looking on this main source of friction that happened after the agreement, the parades and the flags, it's not a coincidence, I think, that the party that felt that maybe they lost some of the privilege, they need to still show expressive identity. Okay, we lost this battle, but still, and I think this is something we can expect to see also in a future agreement in Israel. Another thing that we saw, I think, both in Northern Ireland and Israel, and also we heard about Colombia in the morning, that after an agreement, the moderate forces got weakened, they lost, and for example, of course in Israel immediately Netanyahu won, and after that Hamas, but also in Northern Ireland we can see the SDLP got weakened, and also eventually the DUP that were against it eventually won the election. And also we had violence both, of course, in Israel and also a little bit also in Northern Ireland, and in '98 there was still violence. But the difference was the way that the Northern Ireland was eventually were able to put this, even Ian Paisley, to put him somehow into this new structures. It's also because of him, also because of the process and different parties that different involved. In Israel, it was impossible. It seems that maybe at the beginning we thought that maybe Netanyahu would come into Oslo, and maybe later on it completely collapsed, and you can see that we couldn't able to put the spoilers inside these structures. So this is the thing we're talking about, lesson and differences. Eventually in Northern Ireland, this is part of the miracle or surprise that happened in Northern Ireland, that suddenly people saw Ian Paisley going with McGuinness, and nobody expected that. Again, looking in Israeli perspective, it's something that we would not able to do that. Once Netanyahu is in, Hamas is in, the process is completely lost. And the question is how in the future process we can think about putting, this is the difference between Sunningdale and Good Friday Agreement. John Hume always said this is a Sunningdale for the dummies. That it took them 20 years to put everybody on the table, and this is the question how we can do that in the next process.
We can maybe have more, Michal, I stopped you earlier.
So I'm kind of going back to... Hi. Going back to the beginning of the conversation, Kieran, you were talking about this being stuck on the presentness, and then sort of thinking, Roisin, about your really beautiful and detailed descriptions of how you resolved issues, present issues, but through a lot of kind of detail and nuanced detail at the local level. And just kind of as a scholar who's interested in the connection between the past, present, and the future, but more as an activist, how do we keep the future in mind when things are so bad at the present? How detailed do our visions need to be? Is it enough to have, okay, I say I support the right of return, my ideal solution would be this one, but I think, it's so easy for me to say it. It makes me sound great, but I'm not really, am I progressing it? Am I thinking about it? So that's one question. And then you sort of started talking about it a little bit, but also thinking about, I have a really dear friend whose father was quite high up in the IRA, and he was so cross at her when she came to visit me here. Mm-hmm. And I think this kind of interesting relation between Israel, Palestine, and Ireland is one of the ways in which the tensions and division continue to manifest post-conflict. So for us, we are still in conflict, seeing the post-conflict issues that are now emerging, do you have any tips of how to maybe better resolve them in our plan for the future?
Do you want to take that one?
Also, what should I invest in? Will AI catch?
One of the things I said earlier on that people used to say to me, sometimes you're mad, you can't do that. And I often think that a risky decision taken now in retrospect can be a good decision, you know. So I think you have to have risk takers. I think you also have to have processors, but visionaries are so important in my opinion. You have to have someone that's prepared to say, but what if that could happen, or what if? Because otherwise people will maintain the status quo. It's a humankind trait. And you know, going back to what I was saying, you know, you can't change the past, but you can learn the lessons from it. And what you can do is you can say, and I know I made a big deal this morning talking about, you know, keeping promises. That's what agreements are. It's just as simple as that. A promise that you make to someone else is an agreement. And you know, right back in 1958, Hannah Arendt, in my opinion, had got it right. So for me, you need the processors and you need the risk takers, but you also need the visionaries.
I agree. I was very struck by what Sergio was saying this morning in terms of the Colombian stuff. I found it really fascinating. I've always found it a fascinating place. But I think he's right in the sense that in our context, I suppose we needed the ceasefires. And then we went from that to long-winded, long-winding way to get to negotiations. And in that we had heads of agreement and pre-agreement. I've got a PhD student now who's looking at the pre-agreement stuff. And so we didn't need to fill in all the detail. You did have to have a vision, and the vision was in the absence of violence. And for a lot of people, that was kind of, oh, I just want the violence to stop. But I think we had to be patient in terms of the evolution of it, to even the evolution of the Good Friday Agreement and holding on to the Good Friday Agreement. Then there was the rats got gnawing at the legislation to enact the Good Friday Agreement, you know, and so you had to protect that. And then there had to be a second bill on policing because a Secretary of State had leaned into unionist discourse and essentially almost wrecked the Patent Commission, gutted it, and so on. So you had to protect the agreement, and so on and so on and so on. So it was like a vague vision, I guess, of the absence of violence and some broad heads of agreement that didn't need to be tied down, and a credible process, and then energy about sustaining it. You know, I think that's the reality of what happened. But it didn't all need to be tied down in the vision thing. It required the absence of violence, or at least the absence of most violence, in order to get some kind of a momentum, and then lots of creativity and energy to sustain it along the way.
Can I just run one thing? And I know there's some of you are lawyers here, but there was a part. When I was in South Africa, and I was reading some stuff about the Peace and Reconciliation Commission, and there was a tension between the lawyers and Desmond Tutu, because he was seeing the reconciliation process as a religious, you know, his vision was very different than the lawyers were seeing it as a very technical thing. And I remember this quote, and it's always stuck with me. When the dust settles and when people take their hands from one another, this was the lawyers, when the people take their hands off one another's throats, that is enough. And I remember thinking, no, it's not. You know, and that maybe would be the difference between the legal, you know, the lawyer's perception of it. You know, it just settles, people take their hands off of each other's throats, that's enough. No, it's not, you know.
Can I ask a follow-up question? To phrase it. So there's an image of the Irish as kind of lyrical, romantic, otherworldly, and it's an image cultivated from the outside, but I think some Irish subscribe to it, and it's based on a kind of distinction between the image of the Irish and the image of the British, and it's a myth, but as with that, it's a reality affecting myth. So the idea of the the Irish as the poets and the warriors and so on, and in contradistinction to the British as the pragmatic, rational, sober, technical, industrious, and so on. And it struck me as I was, for some article I was writing, I was reviewing the whole lessons from Northern Ireland thing, and there's a sense that some of the attraction to the Good Friday Agreement itself, but also the process, is this kind of romantic Irish thing, the utopian thing. They've managed to solve what other conflicts have not solved. They were ambitious, and some aspects of especially the line from the article in the Good Friday Agreement where all parties recognize the birthright of the people of Northern Ireland to be identified and be accepted as Irish or British or both.
Yeah.
So this or both representing. But then there's also the attraction of the Good Friday Agreement and the process actually being very English in that kind of energy, being a kind of pragmatic, realistic, empirical, industrial, like very sober. Anti-romantic, being very sober. Let's do the details. Even the agreement is like 60 pages, and this. So I'm wondering, which bit is the stronger? Is it about the combination? How?
I think it is a myth.
And how does it look from the outside?
We murdered each other for a very, very long time. But what I will say to you is, and I think I used to say this to your students all the time, we might have murdered each other, but we're very nice to outsiders. We're very nice to visitors.
I think, yeah, I mean,
No, but the more serious question, was it about, smart technicians?
Yes.
Was it about romantic vision? And don't say both, because that will be easy.
It was more about smart technicians. It was
Okay.
about wordcraft and wordsmithery. I mean, there's a kind of a hidden history. I have a colleague who did a brilliant paper I watched recently about the genealogy of the wording in the Good Friday Agreement. It's Chris McCrudden. Some of you may know, he's a very distinguished lawyer at home. And he's tracing basically the wording that ends up in the Good Friday Agreement. And part of it is super smart civil servants working in the Department of Foreign Affairs in Dublin, and super smart civil servants in London and in Belfast, finding and crafting and honing words. Like one of the things that Chris did, which was really lovely in this thing, it was for the Good Friday Agreement conference. He was basically saying loyalism now doesn't realize the influence that it had, right? So what he does, he goes back. There was a channel of communication from the loyalist armed groups in the early 1990s to the Dublin government before the ceasefires are coming, right? And so there's the Downing Street Declaration, which was kind of pre-ceasefire agreement between it had started off as a process with John Hume and Gerry Adams. It's taken over by the two governments, right? And the loyalists are hugely nervous about this because it starts with Adams and John Hume. Anyway, in this, what happens is a paper comes out from the loyalists and it goes via an interlocutor into the office of the Taoiseach, the Irish Prime Minister, right? And then so Chris traces the genealogy of this. He's got the original paper that came from a loyalist, and he says that this audience, and there's a couple of significant loyalists, there were some loyalists I wish had been at it who weren't. I encouraged some to go, but they weren't there. Anyway, and he says, look, you got that in the agreement. And it's progressive wording on human rights that they had fed through 5 years previously that ends up in the text of the Good Friday Agreement, and it came from the loyalist armed groups, right? And so you had super clever, Martin Manser is a kind of a legend of this, he was a political advisor to the Taoiseach, but lots of super smart civil servants. So the romantic ideal of us as poets and so forth, we like to think about it that way, but actually there was a huge amount of work and cleverness that went on the part of the Irish and the British and others, and that's part of why we had an agreement. And if it had just been about the romantic ideal, it would never have happened, Ron.
I agree. I agree.
Yes. Please.
Thank you so much for this dynamic conversation. I want to refer back to the issue of give the municipalities certain power to do transitional justice at the local level. By doing that, there is also like anxiety or concern that the municipal level may also feel our expectation. So there is some struggle in that. So I want to comment on that like dilemma that we cannot always control how a government will perform because there are so many uncertainty involved and all the political dynamics with party politics. So, but I want to comment that power sharing between the national level and the local level is always good because it invite more players into the stage. So it's broad participation. And with that being said, I also want to acknowledge we cannot control how the government will do. So how about we pay attention to a larger scope of social society? For example, in issues of employment, how about we approach private actors, companies, in their employment, when they do their business, they can create more opportunities for minority groups. So particularly, I want to ask the guests from Northern Ireland that I want to honor both of you as mother and one of the fathers of the peace process. And then, but you represent, I'm not sure, a social activist or a legal scholar, but do you have any experience with the private actors, how they involve, how they contribute, how they sacrifice even for the peace process and for the transitional justice by offering the minority groups and offering to the victims of the conflict with more like opportunities or compensations by doing good? Yeah.
I'm sorry to be negative about this, but I actually seen the private actors as a detriment to some of the stuff that we wanted to do. I can give you a short example. There's a investment site right in the middle of one of the interface areas that was being used by the young people to launch attacks on each other, and there was lots of ammunition, you know, in terms of gravel around the ground and whatever. And they had never developed this site. It was supposed to be an enterprise centre in a very deprived area in Belfast. I'm not going to go into the history of the university, but it was supposed to be an enterprise centre set in the middle of this interface community to provide employment and whatever, and there was never a brick laid, and there still isn't. They had some infrastructure in terms of water and roads. And we approached this organisation, Invest Northern Ireland, right? And that's what it's called, Invest Northern Ireland, and it's supposed to be there to invest in the communities. And we said to them, look, you know, we really need you to do some work on this site, even if there was a couple of mounds that the young people could hide behind, and there was lots of rubble, and we could clear it. And for years, they refused to do anything about it, you know, and I can only talk from my personal experience, and I was desperately trying to find something positive in there. So here, I'll pass it.
Yeah, I'm more sympathetic to the latter part of your question than the first in terms of private sector actors. I'd be similarly negative about them. However, the latter part of your question about the role of civil society is absolutely central. So what you had, and as I said in answer to Lamar's question, you had a significant energy from below coming from civil society actors like Roisin and many others who were in the engine room of the peace process and making the peace process happen. Like that kind of work, stopping violence on interface areas, that's the peace process in action, you know. People involved in community restorative justice projects, stopping people getting shot who used to get shot, that's the peace process in action. And there was a huge amount of energy around that, and civil society at many times, because I don't know if you know, but like our government, our devolved government, goes up and down like a fucking balloon, like, you know. So it's like, you know, it has almost been in abeyance as long as it's been up since we had the Good Friday Agreement. So every time the political institutions collapse, it's civil society that does the hard work, that carries the peace process. But I'm afraid I'd be equally negative about the role of the private sector, to be honest. I can't think of... I mean, probably we're biased, maybe, you know, but maybe there are, maybe once this conversation is over, I go, oh yeah, there was that brilliant piece of work that the private sector did. But it's not coming to me at the moment.
We have a few more minutes where we are about to be running out of time. So I want to ask you if you want to, I'm making a national division here, but I want to ask our visitors if you have any questions for our Israeli friends and vice versa. If you want to do it like that.
What would you like to learn from us?
I was about to, I wanted to say something about that point, but so I mean, like, this has been a one-way traffic conversation about, you know, Israelis and Palestinians learning from us. I have to say I've learned huge amounts over, I mean, as I say, I came here for 30 years ago. This place has always been a real source of smarts for me. There's so many smart people in this jurisdiction. And certainly I'm thinking, I've talked already about, we fed directly in the experience here of the centrality of prisoner release. The prisoner release had to be part of the Good Friday Agreement. And it took a while for that to be accepted. But the influence of this place on that just being a given, that prisoners are going to be part of a peace process, that was hugely important for us. Similarly, for me personally, as I said, with two colleagues, finished a book last year on lawyers, and I have been hugely impressed by and influenced by, I'm not just saying it because three of you are in the room, but how smart and strategic lawyers have been here. Our book was about cause lawyers, human rights lawyers, basically doing clever litigation, and I have been hugely influenced for years by lawyers from this jurisdiction and the clever stuff that they do. So it's by no means one-way traffic. Those are just two illustrations for me personally who have been hugely influential in the way that I see the world from this jurisdiction.
And I would just back that up with Kieran in terms of I have been coming here. It's my first visit, and I'm just so thrilled, and I'm just so delighted to have been here. But I've learned so much over the last 2 days. I mean, it's opened up for me transitional because of the position I'm in, and you view your prism from where you are, and you know, it just widened the whole issue of transitional, you know, justice. It widened it to areas that I hadn't even thought about, and there was these pings going off in my head yesterday and today. Oh, I never thought of that. And when you were speaking today, I was going, God, I never thought of that. And look at, you know, and there's a lawyer, look at a case study, you know, of things that it never had occurred to me. So thank you for that.
Maybe just a comment about this comparison in one word, a great article on that. So first, I was doing a research on Annapolis. We had a process, another round of peace process in 2007, 2008, Ulmert and Abu Mazen. That was actually a little bit serious. And then they created 12 teams, not serious, 12 teams on everything like water, Jerusalem, refugees, and one team was about education for peace. And this team actually went to Northern Ireland, and that was the only team that reached an agreement. Not necessarily because of the travel on that, but so we can see that we have a lot of traveling, a lot of delegation. I can say that I found it especially useful in my teaching here. I'm teaching courses about peacemaking, transitional justice, negotiation, and usually after the theory I will start with other cases, usually in Northern Ireland. And then I can see how students here in Israel, Palestine are much more open to discuss issues like prisoner release. If I would talk about prisoner release, Israel, Palestine, there is no way for it to talk about it after a few seconds. But I'm talking about Northern Ireland. I'm not saying anything about Israel, Palestine. I always use the camera when I apologize about Palestine. I'm not saying everything about Israel, Palestine. All the students will come after the class and start a conversation. Can we do that? Is it possible to do it here? And I'm just putting it there, and I can see I talked about political imagination, how it completely open and expand. At the same time, we also need to be careful not to try to duplicate things from conflict. You know, George Mitchell succeeded in one place, completely failed here. So I always don't like this, some mediators like Dennis was like writing tips for what to do. So also need to be careful not to try to.
I agree.
I'm going to.
Well, maybe just finish with an anecdote, which is funny. Yesterday, we led a seminar for Ministry of Education instructors on a project which is called Shared Learning, which we imported from Northern Ireland. This is our last project that we brought over, which is based on an idea that we learned in Belfast, bringing kids from adjacent schools, Jewish and Arab schools, to learn English together on a weekly basis. We bus them to the other school, and now it was adopted by the Ministry of Education. This, even under this current government, it was adopted, and now it will be funded and scaled. Yeah.
Well done.
Good.
Well done.
Okay, so I think we'll end on this optimistic note. I want to thank Amnon, Lior, Kieran, and Roishin for this wonderful discussion, and bringing to an end 2 days of a great conference. So thank you all. I think most or all of the proceedings will be available on the internet thing sometime soon. So thank you all. We can keep harassing the panelists informally once we add. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.